In this class, we will talk about carbon and how the properties of this element create a huge diversity of molecules. And to do that, we will divide the class in three main sections. In the first section of this video lecture, we will discuss how organic chemistry study the compounds made of carbon. Then we will talk about how carbon atoms, and if you go and see this carbon has 1, 2, 3, and 4 potential bonds. And this is fundamental for life because it allows to have a diversity of molecules. And we will discuss about how this bonding, these 4 bondings, is fundamental for creating diversity in life. And finally, at the end, we will talk about few chemical groups and how they are fundamental, they are key for molecular functions. So let's start. And let's start with the first one, with organic chemistry. To start, we're going to start talking about this big field of carbon chemistry. And possibly you already have seen this in your periodic table and you memorize the atomic number and you memorize the symbol and the atomic mass. What I want to tell you is that carbon is so important and we're going to go beyond memorizing this. Where I want that you know is that molecules like DNA, like lipids, like proteins, all these large macromolecules that we will study in future lectures, they are formed by carbon. So first thing that I want that you learn today in this slide is that carbon is the backbone of biological molecules, and this term of big molecules is macromolecules. Second thing that I want that you remember is if you see here, you see a snail. Snail will have DNA, and DNA is formed by carbon. Also here you see plants. These plants will have lipids in their membrane. Those lipids are formed by carbon. And here in the water, there will be microbes, algae, different prokaryotes and eukaryote unicellular organisms that we cannot see, but all of them will have proteins, and those proteins will have carbon. So second thing that I want that you remember from this slide is that all living organisms are made up of chemical based mainly on the element carbon. And finally, what I want that you remember from this slide is that, and we will discuss this during all the classes, why carbon display this unparalleled ability to form large and complex and diverse molecules. And remember, ability of forming 4 bonds, it creates this unparalleled ability. Now, I don't know if you have seen these type of molecules in high school. These are just examples of carbon molecules, and I told you there is a huge diversity of molecules. These, for example, are called nanotubes, and they seem to have a huge applications in biology. And I want that you watch a video that talk about that. But before that, all this diversity of structures that you can see here and here and here, all are formed by carbon. And if you see, they have different shape, different structures, and they might have multiple functions. So remember, carbon display this ability of develop 4 bonds and have multiple applications, not only for living organisms, but for organic chemistry. And in one implication is, as I said, is nanotubes. And I want that you watch the following video. Now that you watched that video, I want to show you again that there is a huge diversity of macromolecules to make many molecules. And this is not found in nature. This was synthetically created. It was created in a lab, and this is the largest macromolecule or the largest molecule created. And if you see the number here, it has approximately 17 million of atoms. Yeah, so and this is what carbon can do, create really large macromolecules. Now, so we already give you a small introduction about carbon compounds. Now I want that we talk about this diversity of molecules using, as I said, this bonding to four other atoms. To start, I want to remind you that carbon has four valence and that this, as I just said a few times, it makes four bonds. And here you can see the four ways to name or to represent a carbon molecule. So here you can see the name of a simple molecule called methane, and this has is one carbon and four hydrogens. Here in the structural formula you see that they are trying to repel each other, and if you see it in 3 dimension it forms this tetrahedral shape that we will talk a lot about later. However, this is the simplest case. They can be much more complicated, and this is not too complicated, but it's definitely something that we will study later. We have many more carbons. We also have hydrogens, and here you see even some oxygen, and this is very common. So carbon is important enough to have its own branch of chemistry called organic chemistry. I also want that you remember from this is that although organic compounds can be very simple, as the methane that I just showed you, it can also have colossal ones, and this is not one of the largest ones. We'll talk about ones that are much, much bigger in living organisms. And finally, a third thing that I want that you remember is that most organic compounds contain hydrogen, but not only that, they also contain oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And they could even have more, like sulfur, iron, but in this case, these are the most common. And as I show you here, hydrogen and oxygen are very common, and for example, phosphorus and nitrogen will be in the DNA. Now we're going to talk about hydrocarbons, and I'm going to divide it into two because hydrocarbons are composed of two main elements, hydrogen and carbon. And as you can see here in these elements, they are mainly formed by hydrogen and carbon, hydrogen and carbon, hydrogen and carbon, and hydrogen and carbon. So these are the two main elements of hydrocarbon. This is why they have that name. And if you see here, I want that you remember from this slide, the first thing is that hydrocarbons are an organic molecule consisting of two elements, carbon and hydrogen. Now, how we apply this to living organisms? This is an adipose tissue. Each cell here is a storage fat, and here you have a fat molecule, and one of the main components of these fat molecules are hydrocarbons. Here you have 1, 2, and 3 skeleton chains of hydrocarbons. So second thing that I want that you remember, that many organic molecules, such as fats, have hydrocarbon components, like I just showed you here in these 3 chains. And why they are important? Because why we need lipids? Because they store energy. When we break hydrocarbons, they have those chemical bonds will release a lot of energy. And the same thing happens not only with fats, but also with oil, with natural gas. When we break all these chemical bonds, they will release energy. So both in living organisms and in industry, we're taking advantage of these hydrocarbons to collect energy. So third thing that I want that you remember from this slide that is that hydrocarbons undergo chemical reaction that release large amount of energy. So this is when we start getting a little bit of fat because we are storing energy for the future. In this slide, I will talk about the carbon skeletons variation, and I want that you see these schematics. See, compare the length, the position of the double bond, the branching, and the presence of rings. So stop for a second the video and try to see how they are different. Now that you saw the different type of carbons, you saw that, for example, here you find two, here you find three carbons, one, two, and three, and you can continue and have 4, 5, 10, 100. So carbon skeleton can have different length. The second parameter of variation, it could be the location of the double bond. So here you have it at the end, here you have it within the carbon skeleton. The second variation could be the position of the double bond. The third, it could be the branching. So some of them can be linear and some of they can branch. So this, for example, look like an inverse T, but you can have multiple branches. So you can branch later here and form an RT and an RT here. And here you can have T over T, and there is multiple type of branches. So remember, length, double bond position, branching, and the presence of ring is the last one. So for example, here you can see this ring, all these carbon atoms are attached to each other, and this one in particular is toxic. And for example, for DNA, they have these rings in their sugar. So we talk about 4 categories, and I wanted you remember that carbon change form the skeleton of most organic molecules. And for example, they can have variation in length and shape.